coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
It looks like, probably half of all of the social science that's done out there is you can't replicate it. Therefore, the studies don't show as much as people want to say that the studies show. So my point in my thread was everyone, when they hear such a thing in public discourse, should presumptively doubt it. The studies show is just a lazy way, or has become a lazy way for politicians to avoid argument. It's an appeal to authority of a certain kind and should be regarded as suspect. Not because we're anti-science or, cave dwellers, troglodytes, but because it turns out that a lot of the social science, in fact, probably half of it, or maybe even more than half of it, is just bunk.
Hello and welcome once again to the Roundtable, your weekly publishers and editors podcast here at the American Mind. I'm your host, Spencer Clavin, hate speech editor of TAM, and I'm joined this week by cue trumpets and fanfare, managing editor of the American Mind, none other than Mike Sabo himself. Congrats, Mike. You've been functionally filling this role for a little bit, and nice to see you get finally some recognition, as the homeless man says when the trophy falls into his lap in the streets on The Simpsons.
No, glad it's finally out. I really appreciate that.
Awesome. Yes, we're very glad to have you doing such a good job at that. And of course, in his same old, boring humdrum position of just running the entire ship, Ryan Williams, president and publisher. You can't get promoted, Ryan, I'm afraid, from where you're at. There's nowhere to go.
I've hit the ceramic ceiling. I don't know.
Yeah, the gold ceiling, the ivory gold ceiling of Trump Tower. If you go any further, it'll be like the end of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, where you burst out the top of the building into the stratosphere, which could be cool. We'll get Elon Musk working on that.
Yeah, I can help with this interplanetary species business he's always talking about.
Absolutely. Who better? I just watched Interstellar again, the James Cameron sci-fi movie with Matthew McConaughey. And
you mean Christopher Nolan?
Thank you, Christopher Nolan. I know I'm going to get this wrong, and I know that one of these two dudes is going to correct me.
Avatar and spaceships on a dying planet.
Avatar and spaceships. Yeah, exactly. Right. No, that would be the mashup of the century. I can't actually think of two directors whose sensibilities would mesh less well than Christopher Nolan and James Cameron. So scratch that from the record. Delete. Okay, so we'll start with the big headline.
Oh wait, Spencer. Sorry. Let me jump in just to
please
clarify. We're obviously doing some reorganizing in American Mind and at the podcast. James is stepping away from the podcast, and Seth is doing other things as well. But Seth will be back. I'm happy to tell listeners every other week, give or take change. We'll also welcome Arthur Millick every other week. So we'll have kind of a rotating variety for folks. Those who don't know Arthur, he's executive director of the Center for the American Way of Life, our Washington, D.C. office. Also does a lot of work around the states on various stuff, including identity politics and education. Anyway, most of our listeners probably know who Arthur is, but we look forward to mixing it up a bit on the podcast. So sorry, Spencer, take it away.
Nope, that's great. So the big headline we'll start with here: the Titans clawed their way to a tantalizing almost victory against the Jets before being beaten back. Rooting for Tennessee is a form of self-harm, and unfortunately, I'm addicted to it. But that's not actually the headline. The headline is what flickered in ticker tape across any daytime football game you may have been watching on Sunday. I can't remember the last time, if ever, in my life, I've seen an honest-to-goodness breaking news ticker tape over live TV. But I think a lot of us found out about one of these pieces of news that falls under a category, an increasingly large category that I've defined as shocking but not surprising. I think the first time that Trump was shot at and narrowly missed at his rallies, a lot of us feared that there would be another attempt. And now there has been Ryan Wesley Ruth is the suspect, which I say only as a matter of journalistic convention, since this is one of those cases where they nabbed him basically right after he made the attempt. Trump was playing an impromptu round of golf. It was not on his official calendar, which is particularly alarming when you consider that somehow he knew this was happening and that he would be on this golf course. Ruth waited at the sixth hole. Turns out that Trump's security, the Secret Service, travels one hole ahead and plays the game sort of in advance whenever he plays. And so when Trump was on the fifth hole, the Secret Service saw this gun barrel pointing out through the fence and the shrubbery. Another narrow miss, not as visually dramatic as the last one, but certainly equally chilling to think about what could have happened, what direction our politics could have taken, and alarming also as we learn more and more about this guy. This is a dimension of it that's being a little bit dampened down, I think, in your traditional legacy media outlets. But for one thing, Ruth was known to the FBI. They'd gotten a tip about him having illegal possession of a firearm. He's got a lengthy criminal history involving gun charges, hit and run, number of things. So that part of it is of a piece with other shooters whom the FBI have let slip. But similarly noteworthy here, I'll say, is that it seems Ruth had quite clear and vociferous and loud vocal political positions. They were very much in line, unlike Crooks, the previous shooter who was a little bit more inchoate in his views. Ruth really did have what looks like, on the surface at least, your standard kind of boilerplate media hysteria rhetoric infused into his psyche. He took seriously the claim, especially that the war in Ukraine represents an existential threat to the West, the last stand of Gondor against the hordes of Sauron. The way that this conflict is portrayed in the sort of current year media seems to be what Ruth felt, really wanted U.S. involvement directly in this war. So rather than viewing it as a complex geopolitical situation in which, even though there's a clear aggressor, there also may be different factors affecting U.S. interests, Ruth was all in. He went himself to Ukraine, tried to join up, was unsuccessful, and in the process triggered a lot of alarm bells, including one Frenchman who met him and reported to the Wall Street Journal about his passionate Trump hatred. So this was not a guy who made any secrets about how he felt about Donald Trump, about where he was getting his ideas and what kinds of structure those ideas took. You guys, we on this podcast are typically quite cautious about aligning any shooter or attempted shooter with the expressed political views that he or she puts forward. These guys, we take it, I think, as read, are all nutcases and losers who grab onto whatever extremist view is available to hand. But the leftist press will not do the same courtesy to Trump, and already is not. We have an article by Heather McDonald in City Journal about the ways in which Trump's own rhetoric is being blamed now for the shooting, as if he somehow brought this upon himself, rather than, say, the Democratic Party that has been comparing Trump to Hitler and Mussolini and every possible bad guy up to and including Darth Vader. What are we to make of this sobering moment? And do you think any part of this will get through and affect the election, or will we all trundle along, including the press, continuing in our patterns, which in case of the media means victim blaming?
Well, a quick interlude, Spencer, for football, because you are a new Tennessee Titans fan. I'm not an old one. I'm an old and long-suffering Chargers fan, which is also an exercise in self-harm. Both teams have only had one Super Bowl appearance, both in the 90s, and both lost. Although the light is a little brighter at the end of my tunnel because Jim Harbaugh is the new Chargers coach and we're 2-0. So hope springs eternal. But anyway,
Must be nice. That sounds great.
yeah, we finally have a decent offensive line and a good ground game. So we'll see. I'm also married to a 49ers fan, so she always holds it over me that the one Chargers appearance in 1995 was when we got humiliated by the 49ers under the leadership of Joe Montana's successor, Steve Young. Anyway, one of the great Mormon sports players of all time. Fun fact for all listeners. Yeah, the Trump assassination attempt. The Ruth thing is so weird. I read that he voted for Trump in 2016. He became disillusioned and then, adopted all the talking points of threats to democracy and all the rest. It's been surprising to learn that, in the process of the PR that came out about all of this, it's become clear that only the sitting president of the United States has this really tight Secret Service bubble around him. And so that whole course would have been sealed off if Trump were still president. And everyone else has Secret Service protection, but it's porous, as it seems we've learned. Yeah, the media's conduct on this has been shameful. The quick transition was, some species of our friend Heather McDonald wrote up a really brief thing in City Journal about this, that the general line is, well, yeah, assassination attempts are bad, of course, the de rigueur statement from everybody. But then they say, well, Trump, they say some species of Trump and Vance have it coming. They've been fomenting bad rhetoric on their side, and they drive people crazy, and so they shouldn't be surprised when people try to assassinate them. Meanwhile, the media has been, I think the Trump campaign released first through Truth Social, and then it went on to X, this sort of laundry list of statements from the other side about how Trump is a threat to democracy, all the way up to the most extreme, not a sitting politician or media figure, but Wilson at the Lincoln Project saying somebody's got to put a bullet in him, or someone's going to have to put a bullet in him. So Rick Wilson, thanks. Yeah, I keep wanting to say Joe Wilson for some reason. So we've mentioned this before. Just imagine if either of these had gone the other way, and then imagine the various Trump haters from normal, random, insane people on Reddit who want him to be killed, all the way up to the kind of sotto voce. It would be terrible if he were killed, but from the left-wing media, but a lot of them seem to imply that it might be good for the Republic. They're playing with fire. Run the scenarios in your head. We talked about this with the last assassination attempt, mere millimeters from absolute mayhem in our national politics, the unpredictability of which sends a chill down one's spine. I would think that any devotee of democracy, or even quote unquote our democracy, would look with horror at the possibility that Trump was assassinated 2 months out from the election. And yet there seems to be a remarkable lack of self-awareness, coupled with, I guess, what you'd expect, which is maybe a bit of a guilty conscience on the part of some of the media. You saw Chris Cuomo give this impassioned apology about his participation in such rhetoric after this second botched attempt, thankfully. So there's projection and deflection going on as well. Why does the media, they should conclude after their plummeting approval rating and plummeting reputation that maybe they ought to talk a little bit differently about a candidate that many, 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 many tens of millions of Americans love and want to win, if only for reasons of self-preservation and ratings, if nothing else. They just seem to have lost the plot, and it's just an utter failure to think strategically and medium term, let alone long term, about their own credibility and viability as what they really want to be, which is guardians of news and democracy. So it's just short-sighted, irresponsible, and let's hope that at least a portion of them try to change their tune. They follow Cuomo's lead.
So I will join in the football talk too as well, just before I kind of give my take on this. Long-suffering Browns fan.
Mike. Oh, yeah. Now we have a Browns fan in the chat.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. Obviously, we've had decades of utter futility. They've been great the last 4 or 5 years. Deshaun Watson trade looks highly questionable at best, but have a good head coach, have a lot of pieces, actually. So 1-1, especially with the bad first game, was great. We were able to turn it around. So things look pretty good. Hopefully playoffs again this year and going forward, which, 4 or 5 years ago, I would have never said that. I think 6 wins would have been just a massive W for the Browns. So things are certainly heading up.
People should go check out Mike Szabo's piece on the Lord's Day and football at American Reformer.
Yes, I hope we're not currently guilty of football idolatry, Mike. But it's not Sunday, so I think we're allowed to talk about it. And
exactly.
yeah.
I mean, I do certainly indulge in the NFL on Sundays, but yeah, certainly Christians, from what I've seen, have some work to do. I think in how they treat Sundays in general.
I thought that piece could have been titled "Priorities, People, Priorities."
That's exactly right. Yeah, that was just kind of spurned by looking at social media on Sunday morning and saying, Christians in the bio, number one. It's like, aren't you at church? Like, what are you doing? I mean, I'm excited about the NFL. I'm up at 4:30. Like, come on. But anyway, back to Trump, second assassination attempt. At the end of the day, I mean, I think JD Vance's tweet, it wasn't a thread, but it was just a long post, I guess an article on X now that they have that function. It was just right on point. I mean, it seemed like it's kind of more, what if they did this kind of thing? But I thought it was very powerful, showing how the media presented it. Golf course incident. I think that's how the NBC presented it. Lester Holt basically came out and blamed Trump within the first 15 seconds of his report. And it's just incredible, just the atmosphere that the media is trying to create, that they are basically helping out the Democrats in every way possible. You obviously saw this in the debate, but you see this in every reporting on everything having to do with Trump. It all tilts one way. It all goes one way. I mean, it's 99.999% one way. And so this is just of a piece with that. You look at then the Democrat rhetoric too. Trump is an existential threat over and over and over again, as that Trump X post and on social or True Social as well, as he showed, look, this is what they're saying about me. So at the end of the day, are these shooters responsible? Absolutely. They're the people who tried to kill a former president, but is the Democrats' rhetoric absolutely egging this on and preparing the ground for this? Absolutely. There's no doubt about it. You can't call somebody a Hitler 5,000 times. All of a sudden, somebody acts on it to try to take out that Hitler and then back away and say, oh, wow, that's horrible. I mean, this is the logic. This is where that leads. This kind of just dehumanization of a political candidate. This is what happens. So this is the Dem strategy. And then for people, even as Vance pointed out in his thread, if you push back on it at all, first, what they'll do, they'll ignore you, like what they're doing to the citizens in Springfield, but then they're going to censor you over and over again. We'll talk about free speech here in a little bit, but this is kind of their 1-2 punch. They don't want to hear about opposing views. They don't want to hear really about what's going on. Anything that broaches their narrative is suspect to all kinds of legal enforcement, jail time possibly. So this is a real problem. And it really just goes back to the 2024 election. What kind of regime are we going to be? Are we going to be one that actually has constitutional rights, due process, free speech? Or are we going to be one that's headed up by progressives, liberals who have just an insane ideology, who are just going to be going after their political enemies nonstop? And that's the question we face.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I don't think you should be responsible, as you say, held responsible for people who take what you say on any side, no matter how overwrought, and commit acts of violence. That's on the violent person. But I do think you should have to explain what else you expect people to do. If what you're saying, if the case you're making with a straight face is this man has at least the potential and perhaps already is equivalent to our Hitler, then I think the next sentence out of your mouth has to be, but we shouldn't kill him because why? What about that would stop somebody from, if you take that person seriously, going and doing something drastic? And the answer, of course, is that the people saying the Hitler stuff aren't actually taking themselves seriously, at least not in the sense that we hope to take our words seriously. This is a rhetorical tick, sort of like saying it's apocalypse or it's doomsday. They don't really mean it. But as you say, that's where the double standard sets in. I mean, whenever we write or publish about the extreme state of decay in our republic, go out of our way to say, and therefore, here are the steps we should take if we don't want to, as we shouldn't want to, reach a point of real crisis or violence. And I actually think that's a good thing. I think that's a sign of intellectual health and responsibility, that we're tracing out our arguments, recognizing the dangers that they imply, and also proposing alternative courses of action.
Right. You look at even the Flight 93 election, and Michael Anton obviously got tons of heat for that. But what was he actually promoting at the very end of the day? Voting.
Mm-hmm.
That's it.
Mm-hmm.
So, no, I think that's exactly right. It's like the other side, I mean, they just step up the rhetoric nonstop and just kind of leave it open-ended. We say, okay, this is bad, but this is what you should do. Here are the practical steps. And then we make, I mean, from what I've seen, I mean, a very clear difference between, hey, vote, to, hey, it's open-ended. I don't know.
Totally. And in fact, you would know better than anybody. The people on this call basically know well what is involved in those sorts of conversations. And there's no doubt in my mind that those conversations are not happening behind the scenes at CNN, for instance. If you want to say that Trump is the embodiment of evil incarnate, nobody's going to fact check you or say, I wonder if you should kind of tone that down, Chris. Anyway, this is obviously a momentous event, and I'm sure it will figure into future discussions that we have about all sorts of other things. We should all probably be praying that we not see another one of these before the election, or really ever in any capacity. Just a little footnote before we move on, that Trump seems to be put in a reflective and gracious frame of mind by assassination attempts. Have you guys noticed this? After the first one, he attained this kind of serenity, and then this time he said at some rally that, yeah, Kamala Harris called me, Biden called me. It was a very nice call. He's remarkably gracious for all else that's said about him. But let's turn to some more wonky stuff, but also I think really significant stuff. Ryan, you brought this to our attention, so I'll summarize it, but you can tell me anything I've missed. The source here is this Twitter account, Claremont, and I don't know if we know who's behind it, but really valuable, careful analysis of, in this case, social studies papers or social science, rather, papers, and the dubious assumptions behind them, the faulty methodology, the totally irresponsible lack of accountability in major journals that then get retailed and recycled in, for example, Supreme Court decisions. Here, Claremont is analyzing a paper in PNAS, which is sort of a funny acronym that stands for the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. I think I got that right. It's not my discipline, but that's, anyway, one of the major peer-reviewed journals. And it showed up in one of Ketanji Brown Jackson's opinions defending basically discrimination, but affirmative action and taking race into account in hiring and admissions situations. One of her points was that Black at-risk babies, when the mother is having some sort of complication or might lose the child or something really awful might happen, they have better results when their doctor is also Black. And this is one among many good reasons, Ketanji Brown Jackson said, to hire more Black people, why Blackness itself is an asset in some of these professions. So Claremont at the time illustrated, first of all, that not only is Ketanji Brown Jackson Biden's beloved chosen pick, but she's also a historic pick because she's our first, or at least our most innumerate Supreme Court justice. She seems to have mixed up percentage points and percentages, and also failed to take into account that the statistic she was citing was the one before all of the controls had been taken into account. In other words, when statisticians analyze data, one of the things they do is they perform various operations to factor out confounding variables, things that might affect the result, but not actually be the cause that you're trying to look for. Because always you're looking for cause, right? You want it to be clear that it's the Blackness of the doctors that is somehow causing, in this case, the better health outcomes of the babies, because that would be quite a significant thing. And it's something that is often, these kinds of things are often cited. Now Claremont comes back to note that not only was the paper initially suspect because of its wonky p-values that seem to have been fiddled with. Basically, it looked like they were readjusting and adjusting and readjusting their parameters in order to get the result they wanted. But now it turns out there is a major confounding variable, and that is birth weight. So birth weight is a serious risk factor for babies. Low birth weight is something that leads or is correlated with problem births, even fatalities, and all these awful outcomes that we want to avoid. And here's the kicker. Black babies with high birth weights are disproportionately taken to Black doctors, and Black babies sent to white doctors disproportionately have very low birth weights. So this would imply to me, I could be wrong, but it looks like when Black mothers are worried about their birth weights, or when there is a problem that emerges in the course of care, these mothers get sent to hospitals where there's a lot of white doctors. I assume this is a feature, whatever cause you want to attribute this to, I assume this is a feature of the fact that really high-end hospitals have a lot of white doctors in them. And this is the variable that makes up for a lot of the difference that was found in the paper. The designers of the study knew this and neglected to control for birth weight. So did the reviewers at PNAS, so far as we can tell, which means that both PNAS and the designers of the study are responsible for misinformation, for purveying deeply misleading and misused and badly constructed statistics that will now be trotted out ad infinitum. I mean, Clemia's best point is that this correction is not going to be as widely cited as the original statistic, which is such a good talking point that it's going to keep getting trotted out. Ryan, you can tell me if I missed anything. And also, you had a really good point about just the larger point here, not just about this particular study, but the way in which it's emblematic of how junk science, quote unquote, gets used in defense of social justice causes. So maybe you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, just some slight emendations or embellishments. Yeah, I suspect that you have more prenatal specialists that are white than Black, or there's a higher percentage of them, as is the case for a few reasons, at least, in sort of higher end specialties of medicine. So that's, I think, why you get this division between more at-risk babies going to disproportionately white doctors. And yeah, I mean, it's part of a larger problem and a longer story going back. I'm going to channel John Marini for our listeners once again. And his point in his teaching and our fellowships and a lot of his writing over the last 5 decades has been with the collapse of the authority of kind of metaphysical reason in the older philosophic tradition and religion as sources of authority in national public life. That is, with the secularization and the collapse of the notion of natural rights and natural law in American political discourse, and really in political discourse across the Atlantic and the West, what has taken its place? Well, science is now really the only authoritative source of knowledge. And so you have this phenomenon from Supreme Court justices, from political candidates. Their kill shot is always, well, you say X, but studies show Y. And so Justice Jackson wanted to say, look, we need affirmative action because it is directly linked, as this social science paper shows, to health outcomes for Black babies. That is to say, we need more Black doctors than we currently have. It seems like one of the good ways of getting more Black doctors is to favor their applications at top medical schools and all the rest, to funnel more of them to push more of them into the funnel of credentialing and into hospitals, thus saving more Black babies. So it's another version of the age-old political trope, like, don't you care about the children, in this case, children of color. And it was wielded by her as a moral club in her dissent in the affirmative action cases. But so she was basically doing the jurisprudential version of studies show rhetoric. And the bigger point, Cremieux and others like Jonathan Haidt have pointed out, we have this huge replicability problem in the social sciences, where if you can get a hold of data and rerun a lot of these papers' regressions, regression analysis is how people separate correlation, which is linked to causation, from just correlation in general. That is to say, that p-value that you talked about in social science papers helps you figure out whether the correlation that you're seeing was random or would have happened regardless, or whether it's actually linked to the variable that you're tracking. That is to say, is there some causal link between Black doctors and Black babies' health. So, I mean, this is also sort of the backdrop for all of this. But to the extent that we rely on public policy and in our national public conversation about how to do politics and how to benefit certain groups and all the rest, how to distribute benefits and avoid harms and everything, we're over reliant on all of this social science data, which, if you look at it closely, and Cremew's account, this is sort of his specialty. He's a statistician and thoroughly versed in all this stuff and can dig under the hood in a lot of these papers. It looks like, probably half of all of the social science that's done out there is you can't replicate it. Therefore, the studies don't show as much as people want to say that the studies show. So my point in my thread was, everyone, when they hear such a thing in public discourse, should presumptively doubt it. The studies show is just a lazy way, or has become a lazy way, for politicians to avoid argument. It's an appeal to authority of a certain kind, and should be regarded as suspect. Not because we're anti-science or, cave dwellers, troglodytes, but because it turns out that a lot of the social science, in fact, probably half of it, or maybe even more than half of it, is just bunk. And so I think our public discourse would be enriched if we ditched this process altogether. We don't need to ditch reliance on social science, because if half of it's bad, then half of it's less than bad. So it's certainly applicable and useful in judging outcomes and all the rest. But we should defer, I think, more often to common sense, logical argumentation, rather than this invocation of an authority that should be much more suspect than it is.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point to look. This doesn't mean that all social science is bad, but I think what we need to do is look at, say, okay, beginning with Aristotle, politics is the architectonic science, but then there are things below that help you obviously make decisions, especially in a republic. You need, especially on specific topics, you need scientists, you need doctors, you need those things. Those things are very important, which is why that this is a disaster. This replicability problem is not good. So much of especially modern life is not really built on kind of an idea of politics. It's really this kind of capital S science. So to kind of see this authority that they've created, this capital S science, as opposed to actual science, the study of nature, it's not good, but it's an indictment really of modernity itself, and just what kind of the progressive project, I guess, has been for, well over 100 years, as John Marini has studied, and R.J. Pistrio and some others here at Claremont. And so that's a problem, but it's a problem not for us. It's a problem for the other side. And really what we should be doing to get in there and to really push back and say, look, politics is really, it's that keystone thing. It's the cornerstone for us. Social science is there to help, just like many other things are there to help us. But that deliberation, actually reading the law, writing laws, being careful about these things, being precise, that's really the key. And that's what shows what we need to be doing going forward, and just shows how important, politics itself, actually doing the art of politics, studying it, is.
Yeah, and I should add too that it's research by and writing on the subject by people like Cremew on Twitter, as a sort of, he's a throwback, right? He's an anonymous account, but he's a skilled amateur debunking credentialed nonsense. But the solution would be pretty easy, and the social science community is very resistant to it. Which you could solve a lot of this if you made them all post their data sets publicly alongside their peer review process, and basically have it open source and allow all the smart people across the world, and there are many of them well versed in statistical methods, to try to replicate them. And in fact, what you often have is the opposite, as politics has. Well, it should be no surprise that politics has infected the social science process exponentially, or the problem has risen along with the increasing influence of social science on political questions. So this should be an obvious kind of truth. You would expect it. And there are analogs in the rest of the government too. I can't but help think about our friend, dearly departed friend, Angelo Codavilla's quip of frustrations with the CIA. You get CIA to come in and they say to Congress, X, Y, or Z is true. And Congress says, well, what's your source? And they say, I'm sorry, we can't tell you our source. You just have to trust us. People would be in trouble. So we need to break down the many ways in which our supposed experts hide behind the excuse that somehow revealing their sources, obviously sources and methods for intelligence are a little different than exposing your data set in a social science paper, but just removing as many walls as we can from access to this information so that an enlightened public guided by sort of true experts in these fields can try to crowdsource the truth about it. It's one of the great virtues of the digital revolution and social media is you do have these intelligent laymen across the world who can only win followers and credibility by being scrupulous and correct, debunking the professional class who have various vested interests, whether it's from grant money all the way to political influence to hide the ball. And then finally, just compounding the problem is, with a lot of the Cremieux in his thread talks about P hacking. What he means by that is this P value is how you figure out whether your social science study, whether your regression analysis is predictive. That is, whether your variable that you think is driving the outcome actually is. And what people will do is manipulate their data sets, exclude problematic data that would screw up their conclusions. So what a lot of political science is basically a species of motivated reasoning. I want X to be true, and I'm going to find the data to make X true, rather than how it should be, which is I have a question or a hypothesis. I'm going to try to disprove it or prove it. Let the results be what they are.
Yeah, this is a really rich and deep topic with a lot to say on it. You guys have both spoken on it really well. I think that my agent would probably sue me for malpractice if I didn't take this opportunity to plug my book, which is sort of about a lot of this stuff. It's called Light of the Mind, Light of the World. You can pre-order it on Amazon. And it is about science and the proper uses of it and its origins actually in faith, but also it's the necessary requirement that science have an outside source of values and direction, that it actually can't furnish its own justifications or indeed its own verifications. It has to have an overarching value structure, and it always does, whether people admit that or not. This John Marini point bears underscoring, I think, that the word science, from Latin scientia, just means knowledge. And so when in the 19th century, German scientists and philosophers of science especially started to call what the ancients would have thought of as natural philosophy or natural science, that is one specific branch of knowledge, when the Germans started to call that Wissenschaft, knowledge itself or science, they were effectively implying that all other forms of knowledge were secondary or irrelevant. And that's how you end up with somebody like Richard Dawkins in The Selfish Gene. It's either him or the guy that writes the preface quoting another guy saying that we should discard everything before Darwin, essentially, because none of it really has any veracity or validity. And of course, we all know that this is nonsense, in part because you need people before Darwin to explain and justify even what Darwin is doing. And there's an epistemological problem that emerges implicit, Ryan, in what you're saying about how people decide what they think and then come up with a study to prove it. And that is really easily seen, I think, if we consider this problem from the other perspective. So let's imagine now that on this podcast, a guest came to us and said, I've found a study that shows men and women actually aren't different in any way. And you can become one or the other by thinking about it. And let's say that they demonstrated this isn't possible, but let's imagine that they gave us a totally valid scientific study that reveals this. We still wouldn't believe it, even if we couldn't do what Cremieux is doing and find any of the methodological problems, because we know that that's not true. It's actually hard-coded into our worldview before we approach science. And one of the really valuable things that guys like Cremieux are doing is they're showing some of the appropriate uses of scientific techniques to chase down intuitions that we already have, which is we're always doing. Everybody is always doing that, including or even especially these guys who are making these unreplicable scientific claims that they have constructed out of their pre-existing beliefs. So there's a huge and sort of far-reaching bootstrapping problem going on here that's not actually political, it's philosophical. And until we get our heads around it, yeah, we're really just going to be bludgeoning each other with these studies that sort of cloak our most basic instincts and our most primal, sort of irrational thoughts, fears, and desires, cloak those in this language of science to give them a sort of veneer of authority rather than engaging, as Mike is saying, in rational discussion and political debate over whose instincts accord best with the truth and with the general populace's understanding and encounter with the world. So that's all I'll say about that. And note that also there's a tie-in here to our previous topic in that often when you say, well, Trump is always held to blame for his rhetoric, but the Democrats never are, you'll be confronted with a study show that actually experts in stochastic terrorism have demonstrated that it's really only the trend in one direction that matters, and the other one is statistically insignificant. And that game is obviously rigged, and guys like Crimea can show us why.
Yeah, I just want to tell this anecdote. I've told it on the podcast before. It's probably been 2 years. Just the real world view of a certain species of social scientists. So back in graduate school, we had this transdisciplinary requirement course where, you get, it's like whatever it is, 14 lectures over the course of a semester. And you have people from different fields come in, they talk about their methodology and talk about their stuff. So we had this Argentinian economist come in and he said, cue my bad Argentinian accent, forgive me. You had this problem. He sounds German now, doesn't matter. You had this problem, this political science question of instability, political instability. You had this economics question of income inequality. But my political science co-paper author and I worked out no one had studied this before until our paper in 1974 or whatever showed the link between high income inequality and political instability. And me, the poor country political scientist in the back of the class said, well, but I mean, Aristotle talked about that. And the guy's response was, oh, yeah, Aristotle, Tocqueville, they're bullshitters. I mean, they basically, anyone before this revolution in scientific understanding and the scientific method that you referenced, Spencer, and then it's spinning out over the course of over 100 years into all these fields like psychology and political science and all the rest. Basically, they regard anyone who spoke intelligently on these topics before that as, I pressed him on it, and he basically said Aristotle is basically a journalist. Aristotle and Tocqueville are journalists. We're doing real science. That's the kind of conceit of modern social science, and it should. And if you express that sort of thing to normal people, it's when the best quality of the normal American voter comes out, which is to regard fancy academics as idiots, and a species of the cliche that, that's so stupid, only someone with a PhD would believe it.
Yeah. Guys like that, if they had read their Aristotle and their Hellenistic philosophers, would know that the claim they're making is to possess the criterion of truth, that is the touchstone of absolute knowledge against which all else must be measured. But I guess that's just journalism. Anyway, we're running a little short on time, so we got to move on here to our last topic and just touch it briefly. We wanted to highlight and by the way, it was the G.G. Simpson, the paleontologist, who said that thing about Aristotle and everybody else being disregarded. I forgot who it was, but if you want to go look that quote up, that's G.G. Simpson. Okay, so this Theo Wald quote, our own Theo Wald does great work for the Claremont Institute and also has excellent insights, just more generally, has tweeted out this really impressive list, putting all in one place the Democrats' various statements about free speech and what they intend to do, how they intend to determine what counts as impermissible speech and how they intend to go about prosecuting those views. So Hillary Clinton, I'm quoting Theo now, Hillary Clinton says there should be criminal penalties for Americans who engage in propaganda. Tim Walz says there's no guarantee for free speech for misinformation. And then there's border czar Kamala Harris. She actually prosecuted a filmmaker for an undercover documentary of a leftist organization violating federal law. They say you don't have a right to speak. Believe them. That filmmaker is David Leiden. who in 2016, I think it was, when Harris was AG of California, had his home searched, raided by California investigators, then went through an enormous gauntlet of court cases, including an injunction at one point against making further content. So they literally shut him up. And in a civil court, Planned Parenthood, against a civil jury, Planned Parenthood won more than $2.2 million in 2019, and Delight himself was instructed to pay $500,000 in compensatory damages. So they're not kidding around, is Theo's point, basically, about bankrupting you, about jailing you, about coming after you. And I guess just to hand it over to you guys briefly as we close out here, what's to be made of this? What's to be done?
We've raised this on the podcast before, but our elites are increasingly uncomfortable with anyone having access to the free flow of information on the internet. They use the label misinformation to delegitimize, at the very least, if not legally restrict, the ability of the general public to investigate information for themselves. And that strikes at the heart of one of the touchstones of the American founders' view of democracy, which was, there's that famous Jefferson quip about, would I take government with no journalism or journalism without government? And I think I'll take the latter. The premise of a small R republic is that you have a populace that's able to sift information and make decisions for themselves. That is, to self-govern. And we have a political class, which whatever fairy tale or bedtime story they tell themselves to justify this stance, is increasingly uncomfortable letting go of the control of information. Now, this is an age-old problem of government. I mean, the great totalitarian governments want to control information first and foremost for obvious reasons. And we have a ruling class that thinks it's related, as I think you alluded to in the last segment, Spencer, our ruling class that wants to rely on expert rule, but really what it wants to rely on is the experts that it controls that are in its camp and their dissemination of information that could affect elections and their power. So this is just another species of that. It's gone into hyperdrive with the rise of social media, because now any Yahoo can spout anything at any time. And we shouldn't downplay the extent to which, of course, foreign actors are playing around on social media trying to manipulate our elections in various ways, just as we try to manipulate elections across the globe to our advantage as well. So it's not like there isn't misinformation out there, but it's just the cost of having a free republic that you have to let most of it flow. Unless people are committing felonies, trafficking and, sex trafficking or purveying drugs or weapons of mass destruction, you have to let the information flow and rely on the sort of civic institutions and free society to parse that information and to wrestle with it and to make decisions about government. But that has not been the way that our betters have wanted to run government for quite a long time. And then after, of course, post-Trump, with social media thrown into the mix, this instinct to manipulate information and to control the flow of information and to link that control with national security is just yet another way that they squelch dissent and go after their political enemies.
I'll just make two quick points because I see that we're running out of time here. So the first one is, often too, like Ryan said, there is misinformation, there are lies, that's certainly out there. But what the Democrats really are labeling as that are often just simply different opinions, conservative views. Hunter Biden laptop story. Trump, he conspired with Putin to steal the 2016 election. So it's a lot of stuff that is just simply, it's opposing views. It's questions about even the 2020 election, how votes were cast, etc. So it's, within the bounds of reasonable opinion, but they want to shut this down. Obviously, that's going to help them. And then two, this is another point that I've been seeing actually made even just about free speech a lot, even on the right, is that, there's a constitutional right to lie, that this is constitutionally protected speech, even if a lie is done. There was a case, United States v. Alvarez, and that's when the Supreme Court ruled that the Stolen Valor Act of 2005, which that was a federal law that criminalized false statements about having a military medal. They ruled that unconstitutional. But then, you read the dissents in that case, Justice Alito said, look, this goes against Supreme Court precedent. The court has long recognized that as a general matter, that false factual statements possess no intrinsic First Amendment value. And this goes back, I'm going to make probably a point that Hadley Arcus has made time and time again, too. There's another case, Chaplinsky v. New Hampshire, I think it was 1942. This is Justice Murphy. There are certain well-defined and narrowly limited classes of speech, the prevention and punishment of which have never been thought to raise any constitutional problem. These include the lewd, obscene, the profane, the libelous, the insulting, or fighting words. So this is about really kind of some confusion that these points, especially with free speech, kind of rise on the right, and really trying to restore kind of an idea of what the founders actually meant by it. Tom West has actually done a great piece in the CRB, I think 15, 20 years ago. And he said, look, really, this is what the founders viewed as free speech in the First Amendment, no prior restraint. Only injurious speech can be prohibited. So again, libel, slander, defamation, obscenity. But that injurious speech has to be defined clearly in law and punished through due process. So that is how you keep, I think, a republic moral. That's how you have this moral component to natural rights that, look, you don't have a right to do everything. There's a natural law underpinning to that sanctions what liberty is used well for, but then what goes beyond liberty to license. So we have to think about these things. And I hope that, this not only is a political question in the partisan sense, but a larger political question in that sense. What kind of free speech regime are we? What did the Constitution set in place? What does the First Amendment actually protect? So I hope that this, again, kind of, jars our memory, focuses us to look back on what once was and maybe think about how to re-implement that today in some form or fashion.
I'll just add too that Theo will often teach in our Publius and Lincoln Fellowship classes, and he likes to remind everyone the sort of bouncing ball of the restrictive security state started after 9/11 with the George W. Bush administration, and it was born, and this is getting on some of the deferral to expert and the power of expertise to kind of make heaven on earth, originally a progressive view. There's some anecdote, I forget where, but at one point, George W. Bush asked one of his intelligence directors, we need to get to the point where something like this will never happen again. And a normal person thinking about politics and the randomness of the world and the imperfect ability of humans to anticipate everything, both creatively and intellectually, to expect us never to experience a large terrorist attack again, ever under any circumstances, is absurd. Maybe you can limit it. Maybe it will never be 3,000 people again out of the blue sky, but to desire that outcome, that impulse is what gave us this huge national security apparatus, which was originally directed against terrorists, but now through the twists and turns of partisan politics and changing of administrations is now being wielded against American citizens for quote unquote spreading misinformation. So the libertarians had a point. We say that sometimes here on this podcast. You create this whole apparatus and it will be abused by your political enemies at some point. So I should hope that a big priority of a future Republican administration, perhaps the next Trump administration, should he win, would be to do something to reform, shrink, and control this huge apparatus. I mean, I forget what it is. There's 8 or 9 different intelligence agencies now operating in Washington. The CIA, I'll remind everyone, has now 2 political appointees sitting atop it, only 2, the director and his general counsel, I believe, getting a handle on the security state and the FBI for that matter. So international and domestic is a big part of this. And it's not because the MAGA crowd wants to do whatever it wants abroad or at home. It's rather that these tools now that have been in place for over 20 years have become abusive, corrupt, and destructive of freedom and freedom of thought even.
Yeah, it would be one thing if the founders had based their arguments for freedom of speech purely on kind of utilitarian grounds, that this is simply the right way to get the best answer to any question, a la the wisdom of crowds. And indeed, the actual utilitarians, John Stuart Mill among them, were some of the most vociferous sort of advocates of free speech in the 19th century. And those sorts of arguments did exist. It's not like that wasn't part of the idea. You think of Milton's Areopagitica, or even before that, St. Augustine, the truth is like a lion. You let it out and it'll defend itself. You don't have to defend it. So there is a kind of invisible hand version of the free speech argument. But the fact that the founders included free speech in the Bill of Rights actually shows that they were making a totally different case at bottom, beyond whether or not you always have the smoothest course to the best possible answer. The fact that they've considered this a right, and indeed a natural right, shows that they considered it something due to the dignity of human nature. Now, it's a privilege that therefore comes with some responsibilities. And just because it's a good per se doesn't mean it doesn't need to be balanced against other goods. And you can have all those sorts of conversations. But these progressive arguments always approach the question as if once they can just show you how much complexity and difficulty is involved in free speech, how many risks you incur by being free, then at last you will agree that the founders were wrong, and we really just need to hand this stuff over to experts because it's too complicated for rubes to get a handle on. And yet, in fact, we already know all of those things. We already know that there's a risk of misdirection, that there's a risk of interference, that there are dangers associated with freedom. We believe in freedom in spite of those dangers, that it's worth those costs. And there's definitely a degree to which we talk past each other because, as many Claremont Institute scholars have argued at length, we actually have different fundamental values here and priorities. We're interested, as Mike, I think you indicated, in figuring out the best understanding of freedom and freedom of speech specifically as a good per se, as a natural right, among others, which government is founded to protect. And this is another thing that's on the line in this election, is whether that's what we believe. And we're in the process of having the difficult, admittedly, prudential and logistical conversation about how you take that right into the digital age, into all these new platforms, whether we're having that conversation, which is a vital next-gen American conversation that needs to be had, or whether we're just giving up on the enterprise altogether and handing over the keys to unaccountable bureaucrats and autocrats. Choose today. That's all I'll say. Okay, we got to wrap up here, and this has been a really fun one. So thanks to both of you guys, and thanks to all of you for listening, as always, to the Roundtable. If you want to know more about all the work we do here at Claremont, you can check out our various publications, not only AmericanMind.org, which is the site we here run, but also the Claremont Review of Books at ClaremontReviewofBooks.com, our big sister publication. There's also our DC-based Center for the American Way of Life at dc.claremont.org. When I mentioned that Theo Wald does great work for us, he's a fellow there, a scholar at the DC Center, along with lots of other people whose writing and work you can read about there. If you want to donate to support any of this or all of it, you can go to claremont.org/donate, and we'd be most grateful if you did. If the donation is aimed specifically at the podcast and you want us to shout you out, we'll very, very happily do that. Just make a note in there. But all donations for any reason of any size are most appreciated, as is support for the podcast itself, which you can offer by rating us 5 stars, please, or at least keep your bad opinions to yourself. Review, share, subscribe, do anything that lets people know about the show so we can continue to grow the audience. Thanks to our production and engineering crew, Jake Gannon and Logan Zeppieri, and thanks to all of you for listening. We'll talk to you next week.